cooperation has been there, but it was more on an individual basis. There has not been any concerted efforts of collaboration. But Stockholm University actually encourages this collaboration with the human science academic area and with the natural sciences. One evidence of this strong encouragement is actually that Stockholm University has supported a guest professorship that is at the human science academic area and the Nordiska Museet, the Nordic Museum. This is Professor Lotten Gustafsson-Reinius, who has just joined. Very nice. Lotten has arranged a seminar series last fall, which several Bolin Center scientists attended, and there has also been a seminar series at your department, which some of us attended. And now it's the first time actually that we make a real effort to include you in the Bolin Days, because we want to get to know you better and to learn from you. So we have 4 speakers today in this session. And now we have shifted a little bit because Christina needs to go and we're running a little bit out of time. So Christina Fredengren, she will start. And now I do not have your title here. So you will do it yourself.
I will do it myself.
Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to you and then we continue.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm Christina Fredengren from there. We have something.
You have one over there. It's fine. You don't have to touch it. You just have to speak.
Here. Okay. So, Christina Fredengren from the Department of Archaeology, and I'm here today to talk about not only deep time and deep waters, and some projects that I'm doing together with a few of you, and particularly with Arvid. But I also wanted to set the scene a little bit for research on climate and environmental change within the human and humanistic area. First of all, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the strategic focus and investment in environmental research within the human science environmental research area. As Karin Helander and others have joined resources so that we can actually take some extra time to think about how our areas will be able to deal and engage with environmental and climate issues a little bit more. And we have a strategic investment that has been located at the Department of Archaeology and Classical Studies. But this is a collaboration between faculties of Humanities, Law and Social Sciences, where Kerstin Lidén, Karin Bäckstrand and Jonas Ebbesson are in the steering committee. But what I'm going to focus in on a little bit more is the ongoing humanities projects that are within the faculty of the humanities. And of course we have the Arktis-satsning of Lotten Gustafsson-Reinius that I have been a little tiny part of, and it's a really good both process and project. We have another project of Kerstin and others around melting ice and the cryosphere and all the archaeologists that are actually thawing out from under the ice sheet and all the challenges around that. And we are trying to build a research school within the emerging field of the environmental humanities. And then one may wonder, what is the environmental humanities? Haven't the humanities always in some form or the other engaged with the environment? Well, there is a new kind of move on this. Whereas the humanities and archaeology has always been kind of linking these fields together, for example, the environmental humanities is saying that, yes, but the humanities can help in many different ways when it comes to climate exposure and environmental challenges, as this field has always worked with questions of meaning, value, ethics, and politics of knowledge production. And that kind of broadens out the field and maybe the interfaces with climate and environmental matters. Here it's a question about questioning really issues about, are we humans only rational calculating individuals, or should we look at a more denser understanding on human motifs in climate change? And if we start to question the human being as a self-centered, self-ruling, rational agent, what happens actually when we understand that we become together with humans, animals, and nature in different ways? And how does this shape the way nature-culture patterns develop? I am a part, because now we're kind of narrowing down into bits that I'm engaged in. I'm engaged in something called the Seed Box, which is a national node of the environmental humanities in Sweden. It's located at Linköping University, but there are a number of different collaborator university around Sweden, and it also has linkages to universities abroad. But the Seed Box has concentrated on 4 particular problems. They want to deal with the problem of that we are alienating ourselves from environmental problems and climate issues. It's too tough to think about. Let's focus on the now. It's much easier. And how can we actually deal with this alienation? How can we actually learn to think about it without super panicking or freezing or saying that this hasn't really to do with us? They are linking that to issues of the negative or really apocalyptic framing of environmental problems. This extreme alarmism mightn't actually move people to move in the right direction and might just cause this, oh, stay away. They're also saying this thing that in order to deal with climate and environmental issues, we can maybe not compartmentalize the problems because these are interconnected issues where meanings, values, ethics, nature, culture, moves are all kind of interlinked with each other. And there isn't really one technofix that can solve all this. There are a number of different situated measures that needs to be dealt with. So what have we done then at Stockholm University? We have created something called Stockholm University Environmental Humanities Network, because there were once upon a time a network called the Human Animal Studies Network that Karin Dirke at History of Ideas has dealt with. We have had a Stockholm Environmental Humanities Seminar at the Department of English, and we have started to kind of gather ourselves at Stockholm University Environmental Humanities Network, where we're trying to gather our forces and get conversations going. We have also applied for a research school in the environmental humanities. And so far, we have an introduction course that is going to run now in spring 2018. And fingers crossed, we will get a research school proper in 2018-19 into 2021. And some of the issues that this school is going to deal with is here on this place, and basically asking the question, what can the humanities contribute with in regards to climate change and environmental change? How can we use concepts? How can we query the nature-culture divide? And how can we understand, problematize, and develop ideas of the Anthropocene? So that's just in short. If we're looking to kind of narrowing down a little bit and focusing on what I as a researcher kind of contribute with in this, I come from archaeology. I've had a project called Water of the Times that deals with depositions of human and animal remains in Swedish wetlands and waters. And here I deal with sacrifice and sacred waters in different ways. And this is something that one might run a bit further on, talking about what sacrifices we may or may not have to do to overcome the present predicament. I also work within environmental humanities and gender studies. I just got a new project going that is called Checking In with Deep Time, Reconfiguring Intergenerational Justice and Hope. And that project deals with how we can understand when we actually do deep time interventions in the present. What type of actions are going to make a difference for future generations? And how can we talk about issues of intragenerational justice and hope? And here, of course, there are ties to Gustav Arrhenius' big project at Institutet för framtidsstudier that is also located in philosophy here in Stockholm. I'm also scientific leader for Deep Time at the Seed Box, the node down at Linköping University. And we are beginning to brew something together on water archaeologies of deep time. We've been checking in with Östersjöcentrum for a little while. I've been at Tjärnö doing a scoping study. And me and Arvid are beginning to look at water modeling. And Katerini at our department is looking at seals and human-animal studies. So then, why should we actually care about deep time? Yeah, of course, in environmental matters, cause and effect might be located quite far from each other, both geographically and disperse into a variety of different network relations. And cause and effect might last over longer periods of time, so we really need to stretch out the way we're imagining time. In the environmental humanities, concepts such as slow violence have started to crop up to actually put our attention onto this thing, that violence isn't really a direct thing. You might do violence in one generations that might have effects in many future generations to come, and in that way they are conceptualized by Rob Nixon as slow violence. One can also talk about slow sacrifice, actually, and here I'm thinking about my former engagements with kind of sacrifice. And of course, materialized time for us archaeologists or geologists. Time is often not linear in that way because it's actually existing geographically under our feet. But time itself is a concept that you can think about, and think about time as quite queer. Materialization processes appear not always at linear phases, but can appear in all different types of ways. And from that deep time past, we might also want to talk about deep time futures and intragenerational responsibilities. And here we have the Arrhenius project. And then, why care about water? Arvid and I have talked a little bit about that. And of course, much of climate change will really manifest itself to a great extent in water changes, droughts, floodings, water level change, etc. And again, water pollution leads to a number of really unknown extinctions. We know so little about the sea today, so that we can only imagine how many species that disappear. Here we have a photo from Askö, where me and Sissi from Linköping University and David Ferrier from Edinburgh Environmental Humanities were only at the beginning of this autumn, and we were talking to Lena Kautsky about tong and algae. But this thinking with water is a topic within the environmental humanities. Many feminist scholars have been talking about water conceptually, and there are a number of kind of interesting readings that I'm not going to talk about here, but they have questioned the issue of water as a resource for use, or is water a resource for thinking, or maybe thinking time differently. I'm thinking about the lecture that we just heard, going back in extreme deep time. And time philosophy in water works in a very particular way. If we're looking into extreme deep time, of course, the Baltic Sea has changed from being under the ice sheet to only now kind of recovering from the last ice age. Often as archaeologists, we're mapping what could be called lost waters. Here's a map from one of my publications where the lake levels and the sea levels are set at around the year 0. And this is a map that has been possible to produce with the help of Anna Plick, Anna Plick's models, so Camilla Sund's models and Jan Risberg's models, that is coming to use in archaeology. And what you and I, Arvid, are looking to do is to continue to look at water development in the Mälaren Valley. And we have a little bit of scoping funding to look into this, where we might look into land rise, tilts, hydrology, and archaeology, and see what models we can deal with. But this can, of course, be wrapped in a bigger package. Because aren't we also going to deal with lost worlds, these worlds that has a resonance, for example, through submerged archaeology? Archaeologists may also reminisce about Doggers Bankar, this part of the land that eventually was drowned. And there are an emotional side to these environmental issues. Because as a matter of fact, there are a number of worlds to be lost. Here you have both some science reports that reports on how much the sea level might change during the Anthropocene. And we might be leaving very particular worlds behind. Here I have a picture. I was talking to Myndigheten för samhällsberedskap only yesterday, and they pointed out to their app that they have built in on their new web page. And here we can see the particular area where we're situated right now. We're up in that crescent-shaped building. But let us say that we have a water level rise to 4.5 meters. That means that the whole big area of the botanical parts is going to be submerged. And we're actually, as Kerstin pointed out before, going to be back at a landscape that is pretty much the same as the landscape was during the Viking Ages. That is just some food for thought. Something else that the humanities are beginning to look into is the explorations of citizen sciences and citizens humanities. And there are different projects that could come out of that. And I look forward to future talks or future collaborations, diving into matters such as mapping lost waters and waters to be lost, to understand waters not only in a resource way, but also to look back in time when certain waters were actually made holy by sacrifices and offerings. How can we understand underwater myths and materialities, and how can we make these stories, this material storytelling work for us? We can look at future heritage and deep time interventions. What do we actually do? Can we actually realize what difference it makes if we kind of throw garbage and plastics around us in ways we shouldn't do? But this is also a field that has connection points with how you deal with loss or how to inherit well, thinking about multi-species intergenerational justice and care. So that's where I'm finishing.
Thank you very much, Christina. We have time for 2 questions or comments. Alistair and Diane. Here's a mic.
I found that really interesting. Thank you very much. The idea of things we're doing in our generation having being passed onwards many generations in the future is easy for me to understand. Mm-hmm. Are there past examples where when you're looking in the archaeological record that we see something that's done passed on many generations forward, a sort of deep time moving forward that we already can look into the past record and see examples of?
Where there are kind of legacies, there are a number of kind of different stories that I can sort of think about. Of course, there are some stories about how salt marshes in France that were, I think, developed. I'm not 100% sure on the reference here now, but they were kind of developed in the Roman Iron Age, and eventually they realized in this area that they had some kind of environmental problem, and that this was actually eventually going back to these kind of salty marshes that were developed in one way or the other. I'm going to find a reference kind of proper to that one. But then you have also, of course, milder versions of that there are certain land clearings that were opened up in the Iron Age that are kind of still about, and that the landscape is still kind of shaped by interventions kind of going way back in the past. And then you have other stories again where you can see just direct interventions or interactions with old monuments that you address, you continue to bury in old mounds at much later stages. So there is always a landscape to kind of react to. So there are a number of stories like that we could talk about.
Yeah, it's comment basically, and very nice talk, and also good to see the humanity come to this kind of debate and research. And so my question is really about how humanity and social science come into this what we call Earth system science thinking. And I think the framing is the key. And from what I hear from you today is you still have quite a lot of framing that is from the humanity perspective, which is of course natural. But my question is about you also mentioned the future activities about the graduate school or courses. So I think we need a platform where we really talk to each other and maybe have a joint framing or scoping. And what, in your view, can be such kind of platform or place where we can meet and talk to each other?
No, I would very much like to continue to talk about such collaborations and joint platform building. And we're going to try to gather our forces from the humanities side and meet and collaborate. And I look forward to this, the 7th of February meeting.
Where we maybe have to change the date.
Okay,
because there is
okay,
a clash
yeah.
with the workshop of RS 7 and 8. So the date may be a different one.
Okay, the in the New Year meeting.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So absolutely, would like to continue to talk.
Thank you very much. I think I would like to suggest that we continue with the next speaker in that case. And this is, if we go back to the original schedule, that would be Naghmeh Nasiritousi, right? Yes, you're here. Good. Do you have your presentation on this one? Yes? Excellent.
Hello everyone, my name is Naghmeh Nasiritousi. I'm a postdoc at the Department of Political Science, and I have the pleasure to talk to you on the topic of governing the climate-energy nexus, institutional complexity, legitimacy, and effectiveness. So what I would do in the next few minutes is to give you a snapshot of just one of the research problems that we try to tackle at the Political Science Department, and then my colleague Andreas will talk about a different area that we also look at. So to start with, the climate-energy nexus. So this is probably something that you're familiar with. How many of you have seen this particular picture before? Only one. Okay, so I use this picture in my teaching to show the students the complexities of climate change governance. I think it's very useful to see how climate change affects so many different aspects of society. We have science and scientists here at the foundation building up the knowledge about climate change. We have economy and society, law and governance, all including different aspects of climate change. And the energy question comes in quite prominently. We have cars, we have oil, we have biofuels. And the fact is the IEA reports that 2/3 of emissions come from the energy sector. And so energy is quite central to the climate change area. Nevertheless, I have studied climate change negotiations in the past, the UN climate change negotiations. And when we speak to the government representatives there, in the past, there were hardly any energy experts. They were only from the environmental departments, except for Middle Eastern countries that had their oil departments representing. But we are interested in this area that combines climate change and energy questions. So one project that I'm working on is led by Professor Karin Bäckstrand, funded by the Swedish Energy Agency. And the title is Challenges and Opportunities in Fragmented Global Energy and Climate Governance. But the aim of the project is to map the institutional complexity of global climate and energy governance and to evaluate its effectiveness and legitimacy. So what does this mean? Basically, we have a number of international institutions working on questions that deal with climate change and energy. We have, for example, the IEA, International Energy Agency. It's one of the oldest ones, but this organization has members only from the rich OECD countries, and so not developing countries. and their main focus was to coordinate oil supplies. So this energy agency is very centered on fossil fuels, and then a few years back there was a competing institution called the International Renewable Energy Agency that was set up to bring in more focus on renewable energy. So these are just two institutions. We have in our project mapped over 100 institutions working on energy and climate change. And with these hundreds, we include both those cooperations between governments, but also these more private types of networks, including public and private actors that have joint initiatives to try to promote either renewable energy or to focus on energy access or other types of energy and climate questions. So what do we mean by legitimate and effective? Well, just to give you a background, as I said, there have been a proliferation of these international institutions, and policymakers are very interested in prioritizing amongst these institutions, where should we spend our resources. So one of the reasons the Swedish Energy Agency funded us was they're very interested in mapping these different types of initiatives and evaluating which ones are considered legitimate and effective. So in the past, we have drawn from theory to find criteria for what could be considered legitimate and effective institutions. And we, in our literature, talk about the input legitimacy and output legitimacy, where input legitimacy concerns the design of political processes, so what goes into an institution, and output legitimacy concerns the problem-solving capacity of the political process. So when we talk about input, we include, for example, transparency and accountability, procedural fairness, inclusion, who gets to be included in the political process, whereas the output side looks more at the effectiveness and outcomes and impacts, and also how the results are distributed in terms of fairness. And typically in the literature, scholars have looked at institutions and then evaluated according to these criteria. We try to do it a bit different. So we want to examine common understandings of what makes an institution legitimate and or effective, and to look also at how these understandings diverge amongst key groups of stakeholders. And by that we mean the types of people, the climate and energy experts who have come into contact with these organizations. We want to understand which ones do they find legitimate and which ones do they find effective. So in our project, we highlight an aspect of legitimacy and effectiveness that has not had much focus in the literature, and that's how key stakeholders value these concepts, and that's what we call sociological legitimacy. So we argue that there's a need to unpack the concepts of legitimacy and effectiveness in a changing context to better understand what they mean to key stakeholders, and that these perceptions are likely to vary depending on who we ask. And by understanding how these perceptions vary, we can gain important insights into the factors that contribute to legitimacy and effectiveness amongst international institutions. So how do we do this? So as I said, we want perceptions of these institutions among key stakeholders. And for that, we have designed a questionnaire that we launched 2 weeks ago at the UN Climate Change Conference in Bonn, where we targeted climate and energy experts to ask how do they define legitimate and effective institutions. And we also gave them a set of institutions to evaluate based on the criteria that you saw earlier. And we have also done some interviews with experts from different countries and also non-state actors. And we find, well, these are very preliminary findings, but that institutions are perceived to be good at different things. So some are very good at the input aspects and some are very good at the output aspects. But generally, most agree that the effectiveness of these institutions that is lacking. Yeah, so that was a very quick overview of our project. Look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Are there? Yes, there are questions. Karen.
That was quite interesting. Thank you. It would strike me that the criteria would depend on the stakeholder you're interviewing. So are the criteria allowed to vary, or did you set the criteria that they're using to, your stakeholders are using to evaluate within your survey?
Yeah. So we have open questions where they're allowed to basically say whatever they want about the institutions. But then when we ask them to evaluate the institutions, we give the set criteria. So we also want to compare if they mention the same types of institutions for those open questions compared to the closed questions.
Great.
So based on legitimacy and effectiveness of inputs and outputs, how would you, in a few words, rate the Paris Agreement?
Oh, complicated. So if we compare to, if you follow the process, you know what happened in Copenhagen maybe, that the negotiations basically broke down and just a few countries wrote the Copenhagen Accord, which was rejected by the plenary. But the Paris Agreement is very much modeled on the Copenhagen Accord. So what we had there was a crisis of legitimacy because only a few countries signed up to the Copenhagen Accord. Whereas in Paris, it was a very transparent and open process. But you basically had the same outcome only a few years later. So the process to get there was to get more countries on board. And you need countries on board. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to say whether it will be effective. But I believe because of this open process in the Paris Agreement, you have more countries on board. And you've seen that with Trump withdrawing, there haven't been a domino effect of countries withdrawing. In fact, Syria just joined, so the US is the only one left out. So there's hope.
You can gain Nicaragua too.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just wondering specifically whether you think that the Paris Agreement sacrificed too much effectiveness in order to gain legitimacy, or in general, do you see these two things as conflicting with each other, or do they generally push in the same direction?
No, there can definitely be trade-offs, and if we look at just the criteria for effectiveness, we have output, outcome, and impact. And between output and impact, for example, there can also be trade-offs. So you can have lots of output but very little impact, or you can have little output but much impact. And I hope the UNFCCC process has been little output but big impact. We will see.
Now I'm taking the microphone from you because we need to move on. We can postpone. We have a PICO poster presentation session afterwards and the poster, so there will be plenty of opportunity to ask further questions. But now we move on to the next talk given by Andreas Duit, and this is on the environmental state. And I guess there is a double meaning in the title.
Not that I'm aware of.
You know, okay.
Okay, where is it though?
Where is it? Let me see. Can we? Is this?
Oh, okay.
Should be here.
Yep. Sounds about
No.
Okay, thanks for having me. My name is Andreas Duit. I'm a professor of political science, and I'm also the co-director of the leading research area, ECTS, very cleverly constructed acronym for Environment, Politics, Policy and Learning, which we have over at the Department of Political Science. And so we're trying to develop social science environmental studies, essentially, and as part of that, we've just started a master's program, which is also very cleverly acronymed IMPRESS, International Master's Program in Environmental and Social Science. So we too are trying to do something in the environmental area, and we're trying to build something here. Where we're headed and where we'll end up is, of course, another matter, but we are trying to do something in terms of furthering environmental research. But that's not really what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about some of my own work, which is on the state and the role of the state in addressing environmental problems. And the title of the talk is the eco-state, or the environmental state. I think it was in the program, but that's probably my fault because I use both terms. So what I'm going to do is show you a few slides about that, and then hopefully we can have some questions after that. So the structure of the presentation today is this. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call three solutions, just to give you a background as to why I'm interested in the state. And then the state N. Okay, well, forget about the N there. State mistrusted and forgotten. And then I'm going to move on to the question of, well, can the state solve environmental problems? What is the prospects of using the state for doing something about the problems that we're facing in the environmental area? I should warn you, though, I will not have all that very much to say about the climate as such. I hope that's not too disappointing. This is more about environmental politics in general. I think you will understand what I mean as I go on. But just to give you a short background to the why we focus on the state here. Well, if you, most of you are familiar with all these pivotal publications in the environmental debate. It started with Silent Spring in the 60s, the limits to growth in the 70s, Our Common Future in the 80s, the Anthropocene in the 2010s, and the planetary boundaries came at the same time. Those are, very familiar milestones in the environmental debate, and they have a few things in common. Even though the themes and the ideas have shifted over time, I think you can also distinguish a couple of things that are more or less constant across these 50 years. And the first thing, of course, is the fact that all of these are essentially scientists sounding the alarm bell, saying that society needs to do something about the problems that we've discovered here. So that is very much a red line running through all the way from Carson to the Rockström and et al. Same thing there. Scientists saying that we need to do something about the problem. And so, well, if you go to, well, what have the solutions to these problems been? Well, I think there's a certain degree of consistency there as well. Our first solution is, of course, the global accords that we heard Naghmeh talk about. Started with the Stockholm conference and then just kept on going. And this is, of course, from as the Paris COP, but there are many other similar meetings such as this, and there are many other global accords designed to take care of other global environmental problems. And the idea, of course, is that environmental problems are global, and therefore we need to reach global agreements across different states in order to do something about them. And the second reoccurring solution is changing lifestyle. We need to do something about how people think and feel and what they value and what kind of attitudes they have and how they're structuring their daily lives and what their habits are and so on. And the way we do that is typically through education and persuasion and that sort of stuff. But it's been a very salient feature all across these 50 years. And then the third solution then is technology. Well, we can solve environmental problems by developing better technologies, which will allow us to have less of an impact on the environment. And there's nothing wrong with these three solutions. There's sort of the standard toolkit for environmentalists. But in all that, I think that we have also, to a large extent, forgotten about the state. And to me, as a political scientist, I view the state as one of the main, or one of the most peculiar, or perhaps most important inventions that humankind has ever come up with. It's a very distinct organizational form, which is, and it's also very recent. The state that we today think of when we talk about the state. So it's a form of social organization, and it is pretty recent, and it also has a lot of features that allow us to do a lot of good, but also a lot of damage. But in terms of the environment, we haven't been really talking too much about what the state can and cannot do. And one of the reasons is that there's been a great deal of mistrust or distrust among both scholars, but also activists in terms of what the state, the potential of the state. And why is that? Well, I guess it's because of this very familiar story that state action and what the state does for the environment is ultimately dependent by political representatives, and they are usually, at least if they're democratically elected, they are accountable towards their electorate, right? And that creates a very specific dynamic. And one of the things that it does is that there's a very clear tendency for environmental policies to offer short-term distributive gains to any specific group in society. In the sense that if you vote for me, I will immediately give you something back that you will feel as valuable. What it does is rather that if you want to impose an environmental policy, you will have to persuade people to accept a short-term reduction in well-being for an uncertain increase in well-being further on. This is all well known to you. But the point is that there's a very fundamental difference between, as a representative, proposing to your electorate, if you vote for me, I'll build you a new daycare center. I will make the trains run on time and stuff like that, and that will hugely improve your well-being in the short run. And therefore you should vote for me now, as opposed to saying, I want to do something about climate change, so what I'm going to do is to make it more difficult for you or more expensive for you to drive your car, or maybe you won't get to go on these nice trips abroad. As you see, that's a very different kind of political dynamic in those two cases. So as a result, there is an inbuilt tendency in representative democracy to have a hard time handling environmental problems. The very nature of environmental problem makes them very difficult for the state to handle, essentially. And with a few exceptions, and those have already, for the most part, been cleaned up, such as like point source emissions, which impact people's health here and now. But most of those problems we've already taken care of. So the point here is that, well, for good reason, you can think of the state as being unsuited for handling environmental problems. So, and just an illustration of what I'm saying here is that I think this is kind of interesting. This is from a survey that they did in the U.S., and for some reason it's on county level, but it doesn't really matter. The interesting point is about the two pictures here. These are the percentages of people in the U.S., and it's somewhere around, 50, around 60 or 70% of people in the USA agreeing with the statement that they are worried about global warming. So most people, even in the U.S. and even in these parts of the U.S., agree that there's something to be taken seriously about global warming. But if you ask them, will global warming hurt me personally? Most of them disagree. And the point is also that they're probably right. They won't be hurt by global warming here and now, or at least most of them in their lifetime. Maybe their kids will be, but most of them won't be hurt by global warming. You can't feel global warming. You can't see it. You can't really sense it. This difference between that and that, again, feeds into this political dynamic that I was talking about. So, we shouldn't expect the state to do very much in the environmental area, should we? And that was sort of the assumption until I accidentally, more or less, came across this pattern or data, which is from something called the Manifesto database, which is a database of all party manifestos in, I think there are up to 50 different countries for a very long period. It goes back from from 1945 up until today. And what they did is that they coded the textual contents in all these party manifestos, which is what parties put to the electorate when they go to an election. You know, this is what, if you vote for us, we want to do A, B, C, and D, right? So they coded the proportion of text in these manifestos devoted to different policy areas. So it gives you a very good measure of what parties think are important issues to present to the public in order to gain re-election. Right? So, and here's a very interesting pattern. This red line is the welfare state, or exactly more precisely, welfare state expansion. It's the proportion of these manifestos devoted to promises about expanding the welfare state, building a new daycare center, making the trains run on time, that kind of thing. And it's a slight upwards trend, but it varies a lot over time. But it's almost constant here. And this is the corresponding category for reducing the welfare state. I just put that in for. But the interesting thing is the green line here, which shows a very marked upward trend. And somewhere around 1989, it is on par with the welfare state. So that kind of goes against what I just said about how the environmental issue is not really working well on the electoral arena. Because why else would then party be talking as much about the environment as they would about the welfare state? So clearly there's something going on here, and the question is what? And in order to find out more about that, we thought we'd look not just on what parties say, but also what parties do, or what states do in the environmental area. So we applied for money and to construct what we call the GRACE databases, governing the Anthropocene. It's the acronym for GRACE. And what we did was that we collected data for if and when a country puts in place a policy regulating any of these different environmental problems. And some of them, we also collected limit values. For some of them, it doesn't make sense to collect limit values. So we employed a small army of student coders, and we coded that data for these countries. So we had 37 countries, the ones that are grayer, and we coded 30 different policies and 10 different limit values for the period 1970 to 2010. And I guess for geographers, that is not a very long time period, but for political science, it is a pretty long time period. And it allows us to say something about what the state does and what different states do for the environment. And what we get then is this. This is just the aggregate cumulative number of policies in place out of those 30. And as you can see, all curves are going upwards. It's just a matter of how steep the increase is. And some of the countries have a more steeper increase, such as South Korea. It goes up very quickly. Whereas other countries, such as Sweden, and Switzerland, even start to level out in the 2000s. They don't put in place any more policies. And what also surprises us was the fact that there are differences between developing countries and developed countries, but they are catching up or getting closer, much closer than we thought they would be. And in some cases, they're even more progressive than developed countries. For instance, efficient water users. But in all, this gives us a very good idea about what the state does and does not do for the environment. And it gives you as a good data source for being able to run analysis in order to explain, well, why can we, what explains this development, and how can we explain differences between countries. I have some slides about that, but I guess I'm going to have to skip that, right? Okay. So, and all this also leads us to talk about or think about are we witnessing an emerging ecostate? Which you can think about in similar terms as you would the welfare state. The welfare state is essentially a political response to a problem in the market, a problem of market externalizations of social costs. And you can think of the environmental state or the eco-state as something similar going on, only in the environmental area. The state is essentially trying to do something about problems caused by the market. I can't say anything about that either, can I? No. Well, we've started doing some analysis of whether or not this matters or not.
And
But,
we can continue at our workshop in the spring.
oh, all right. Okay, so just sum up here. There's been, what we've covered so far, there's been a strong regulatory growth in the environmental area in most developed and developing countries. And that is, to a certain extent, surprising, given the dynamic I was talking about before. And I think it's fair to say that environmental protection is now a core state responsibility. It is something that every state has as a very central mandate to take care of. But the eco-state is still weak compared to the welfare state in terms of how much resources it transfers between different areas in society. But on the other hand, the welfare state emerged over a period of about 100 years before it reached its apex in the 70s and 80s. And by that measure, the eco-state is about halfway in terms of what the state can and cannot do for the environment.
Thank you very much, Andreas. That was a very hopeful last sentence.
Oh.
That we're only halfway. There's time to get these developments in place. I'm afraid we have to move on to the last presentation. We can take any more questions then in the session that is continuing out there with the posters. But now it's Roosvall who is talking about media and transnational climate justice. Indigenous activism and climate politics. I'm looking forward to that.
Should I allocate the time or so?
Den frågan var det förut. Var det Anna?
Ja.
Hi everyone. I was relieved to see before that I wasn't last in the program, but now I am. But I guess you've all been here, so I guess you'll bear with me. So I'm going to talk about media and transnational climate justice, indigenous activism and climate politics, which is incidentally the title of a book that's coming out soon. I've co-written this with my Canadian colleague, Matthew Tegelberg, so I'm now going to draw on some materials that I've collected together with him and some analysis I've done with him. As a media studies scholar, I have to start by pointing out that most people learn about climate change through the media. Most people outside this room learn about climate change through the media, maybe, through news, reportage, and opinion pieces, and so on. And naturally, most people also learn about the injustices pertaining to climate change through the media then, how climate change has simultaneously these common global effects and the very uneven particular local effects across and within nation states. Most people, in a similar way, learn about responsibility in relation to climate change through the media, and about who is to be termed responsible for past and current emissions, and who is to take responsibility for amending them, including paying for this amendment. We have the polluter pays principle, the beneficiary pays principle, the ability to pay principle, and all of these tend to point roughly towards the same states to take responsibility. And states are specifically pinpointed to take responsibility since they are the entities where we find sort of the most power to address such issues. And since they can also be expected to take collective responsibility for things done, including things done in the past. There are still disputes, of course, over where to draw the line for responsibility in the past, depending on, among other things, when we can expect people to have known about the negative effects of emissions. And then there are disputes over the right for previous low emitters to catch up on wealth through current and future emissions. while I thus recognize the importance of the states in this respect, I want to direct attention now to what has largely been missing from such discussions. And one such issue is transnational injustice. We discussed this in relation to the transnational nature of climate change itself, and also to indigenous peoples who often constitute transnational groups, like the Sami and the Inuit, for instance, and also tend to work together transnationally between groups from diverse parts of the world, all lacking proper representation at the UN climate summits where states negotiate, while indigenous groups are often the ones most acutely affected by climate change. And another issue that is largely missing from the discussions of the aforementioned principles is the division of justice in issues into three distinct areas, of which generally only one is tackled by these principles, and that's the first one, the redistribution dimension, pinpointing economic injustice and maldistribution. But we also need to tackle recognition. We also need to tackle cultural injustice through recognition. We need to amend the misrecognition that is going on. And we also need to tackle political injustice, which comes out in terms of misrepresentation, political representation, for instance, at the UN climate summits, and misframing. And I'll come back to misframing. First, I want to have a short look at these climate testimonials that we summoned from Indigenous activists at different climate summits. And I want to point to a couple of those just as examples. We have Justine Demay of the Tuvalu people from the Philippines, who says, for instance, due to the consecutive typhoons that arrive in our country, many of our crops have been destroyed. And of course, our farmers have no capital at all. So she points to the economic injustice there. Then we have Tiano Tuyono, a Maori person from New Zealand and the Cook Islands, and he says that burial sites where some of our people are placed, they're starting to erode into the ocean, so that's a major impact of cultural significance to our people. So he pinpoints there the cultural injustice and the recognition needed. There are many similar testimonies from other parts of the world, looking both for redistribution and recognition, in different contexts of ice and snow, or the lack of ice and snow, or rain, or the lack of rain, and so on. Political injustice was also brought up a lot, not in these climate testimonies, but when we asked interviews about media and interviewees about media activism and the political process at the climate summits. And such political injustice is connected to what Nancy Fraser terms the worst injustice of all in globalizing times, which is misframing. So misframing occurs when an inappropriate scale is imposed upon a cause of injustice, such as when a national scale, a nation-state scale, is imposed upon a transnational source of injustice. And this often, of course, occurs regarding the transnational phenomenon of climate change, and also in relation to transnational or international indigenous groups. I'm going to relate to this political level now by detailing how witnessing about climate change in the media come out differently in different types of media. So here we see in this table we have to your left the edited media witnessing. That's what's going on in regular mainstream old media, edited by journalists and editors. And then we have the self-edited media witnessing that go on in speeches put up on YouTube by the indigenous activists themselves or their associates, their media material put up on their own Facebook pages, made by themselves, and so on. And I'm going to point to a few levels here. I don't think I can do all of them. So the level of presence here, we distinguish between three levels of presence from the start. And first we have mere presence, when people are there, but they're not speaking. Since this is witnessing, people are speaking. So then we have the level of dialogue, where they are speaking to the journalists here. And then there's a stronger level of presence, which we call political deliberation, which only goes on in this material. Agency comes out in terms of reactions here to the journalists' questions, for instance. And there's a conditional agency. You get to talk about certain things, as we will see further on. Here it's more action, and it's an unconditional agency. You can talk about anything, and it's a lot of talk about politics. and political injustice. I'm going to skip this and see what they witness about. So here it's mostly about weather and climate as such, and spiritual and cultural aspects. And here we see much more on witnessing on political injustice in relation to the weather climate crisis. And sometimes here they can combine political and spiritual aspects, which never happens here. And looking at the last part here, at the geographical scales, here the indigenous peoples work as intermediaries from the local to the global, witnessing from their own environment to sort of help the rest of the world realize that we have to do something. Whereas here they speak both locally and globally at the same time and get to speak about what is needed to be done in their own environments, not just to help everyone else save themselves. So that's what's going on a bit differently in these different types of media. And very old-timey is use this one, isn't it? Yeah, that's strange. Building on that example analysis and building on a lot of other analysis that we've done on media material from 2007 to 2015 and interviews done at a couple of UN COP summits, I want to point to a few conclusions that we come to concerning how mediated communication could be bettered or enhanced to tackle injustice better. This is normative, of course, but let's not pretend that we don't look at communication normatively as it is now. We do have rules and ideals that we play by. So these are some suggestions of what we could do based on our analysis. So we suggest a solidarian mode of communication, and mode is an important part here, not just the solidarian. Mode concerns not only what you talk about, but how you talk about it, your attitude, how you address it. And so whether it includes all three levels of justice, which we hope it does, or whether it relates to scales beyond the nation state, which we hope it does, we want to focus on how this is expressed. And I want to point specifically to reciprocity that you see in red there. Reciprocity relates to communication as such in that it is dialogical. It goes both ways. Charity approaches that we sometimes distinguish from solidarity approaches, they are one-directional, but solidarity is often seen as dialogical in this way. The other party in the solidarian dialogue may be hindered to reciprocate because of an instance of vulnerability or economic injustice, for instance. But the point is that the other party is seen as someone who could have something interesting to contribute, unlike in this monological, one-directional charity approaches. So a solidarian mode of communication is dialogical, but it actually goes beyond dialogue as such. It goes beyond any type of dialogue in how all these other aspects are included too. And they relate in some way to the theoretical starting points that I already mentioned. They relate to justice and responsibility. And here we talk also about the responsibility of the media as powerful agenda setters and gatekeepers and storytellers in our societies. Such a solidarian communication is at the same time then not restricted to nation-state frames. Responsibility needs to surpass those geographical scales today, not the least concerning climate change and indigenous peoples. And this is, of course, a problem with mainstream legacy media sometimes and their strong ties to the nation-state frame, not only in terms of language, regulation, and audience and so on, but also in terms of how content is captured, how the world is understood. And like I said in the beginning, the world is to a large extent understood through the media, not just climate change, but the world. And mainstream legacy media could learn from how the or self-edited media witnessing is handled in self-produced indigenous media in this sense. At the same time, we also want to point to that mainstream media still has a hugely important role to play in holding politicians responsible. There we have another aspect of responsibility on national levels and beyond that. Thank you.
That was very fast, and I must admit I did not understand it all. There was many new words for me, many new concepts and ideas, so I might need a repetition at some point. Anyone who is having a question or comment? No? All right. right. Then I would like to thank everyone in this session this afternoon for great and inspiring talks. Thank you again.